plague of human vampires. A 300-year-old witch who legend says can only be freed from her chains and return to youth and beauty by a phantom kiss. Incredible in the 20th century. Yet, a tiny nation is terrorized by these ghastly beings who inhabit a medieval torture chamber beneath an ancient castle ruin. Follow the Phantom through a chilling web of superstition, fear, and deadly danger. The story of the Phantom, number 12. The Vampires and the Witch.
Hello and welcome back to this damnable idealistic crusade, all Phantom fans. For those who came in late, this is my latest review in reviewing the Hermes Press reprints of the classic Avon novels, novelizations of iconic classic tales of the ghost who walks himself, the Phantom. Now this is book 12 of 15 in this series, released in 1974, entitled The Vampires and the Witch. This is one of the volumes written by primary writer and series creator Lee Falk, which does elevate it over the other books because you have the primary writer and the creator of the character and writer of the original newspaper strip stories that this book is based upon, actually writing the story and getting to expand upon it. So, as I've said in previous reviews, it's the volumes written by Lee Falk that you can very much tell, even if you didn't know who wrote it, that has the greatest handling of the character, the greatest sense of the character's world, and the trademark sense of the Phantom retaining a sense of humility and humor about him, even as events that transpire get increasingly suspenseful, dangerous, or even kind of weird and spooky, as what happens in this book, as you get from the title and the lovely pulpy cover. This is actually, like Killer's Town in this series, a combination of two pre-existing stories, which does help flesh it out for expanding into a novel. Some of the other stories that have been adapted for the Avon stories that I've talked about in terms of book form, they don't feel as fleshed out because they are taking a simplified storytelling element because they had to be designed for just a few panels per day in a newspaper telling an ongoing story and also being able to be understood by people just picking up the paper that day. So expanding those into novel form is actually quite an interesting and would be a difficult challenge, I think, for anybody. So the couple books like this one and Killer's Town, where you have the original writer actually combining two different story arcs, I think makes for a more fulfilling novel. Now, The Vampires and the Witch actually deals with one of the Phantom's exterior bases of sorts, which is actually in a castle in the country of Caecania. I guess I'm pronouncing that correctly, which is basically a sort of mythical, made-up mixture of various European nations, but it's sort of a stand-in for Transylvania. As is obvious, this book does deal with characters that may or may not be vampires. But essentially, the Phantom travels to his secret lair base or base of operations for the area, and has essentially been alerted to the fact that someone has gotten into said area, and he manages to also uncover something that is very weird going on in the town, and the local inhabitants are terrified because they're essentially being plagued and terrorized by figures that appear in the night and have the appearance of and some of the hallmarks of vampires. And if this were not enough, the Phantom is also confronted with possibly having the physical manifestations of a witch character who was supposed to have existed in the past many centuries before there in that castle, and who had dealings and is part of the lore of his ancestors, because the Phantom is a generational hero. He, of course, has read of and knows of the tales in the Phantom Chronicles about one of his ancestors actually dealing with the Henta Witch, and the chronicles seem to indicate that there were actual supernatural elements involved, which the Phantom himself questions, as any pragmatic, realistic person would in our modern age and time. So this is one of the Phantom tales that not only deals with possibly having elements of the supernatural, or of course someone using that for their own gain, but also dealing with the Phantom as a generational hero because he's having to actually interact possibly with elements, forces, or entities that were in existence centuries before and dealt with one of his ancestors as the Phantom. And that's a particular element that you're only going to get with a generational hero character, and that's something that's very much unique to Phantom stories. And so that helps to further set this apart. So this is not only a generational Phantom story interacting with elements of the past, but also getting into more of perhaps the supernatural. And the fact that you have the original creator writing the story and blending together two different pre-existing newspaper stories means that this is a more fleshed out novel experience. The Phantom has his sense of humor, he has his wit and his charm more on display, and you also get a greater sense of the world around the character, and you get some nice sort of supporting characters in the small town, and you see Lee Falk getting to play around with the sort of, I mean, basically the cliches of a vampire film or vampire story, or being in a Transylvanian type village where all of the people, whether they believe in vampires or not, are extremely fearful and very superstitious and have all kinds of customs in place, and they don't want to talk about anything. So it's fun getting to sort of play around with horror movie cliches, if you will. And with all Phantom stories, this is merely just a wonderfully fun, engaging adventure. And it's nice and refreshing to get it more fleshed out than what you have in the iconic classic newspaper strips. So even if you know the original two stories this is based on, or even if you can sort of guess where the story is headed, there is a nice little bit of a mystery atmosphere to unravel if you're not familiar with these stories. But because it's, you know, a slightly unique blending of those two pre-existing stories, it's a more fulfilling novel experience to just pick up and read as a book, as opposed to some of the other Avon books by other writers where they're just taking a straightforward story and doing a straightforward adaptation. So as always, I do think the books in the Avon series written by Lee Falk are the best ones. So I do think this is one of the best of the Avon books. And if you were curious about picking up any of these, I would suggest starting with the Lee Falk written ones first, if you're just, you know, looking to maybe try a few. Or you could just go in chronological order. There's not really a set chronology in terms of these. You can read them out of order if you wish, but I think it's fun to read them in the order of publication. But again, you can very clearly tell when it's the series creator and primary writer writing one of the volumes as opposed to some of the other writers. And that's not to say the other writers' Avon books are bad. It's kind of an unfair comparison. So here we have the Hermes Press reprint done in the same oversized, more premium format style as all the other volumes, with the lovely matching spine. So these all go nicely together on a shelf. This recreates the beautiful George Wilson artwork of the original Avon paperback, obviously done in a very pulpy style because these were done to market the Phantom for the sort of exploding men's adventure paperbacks of the 70s and 80s, which became a sort of cottage industry. But all of these were done by Wilson and they're just beautifully pulpy with a very bold color background, and they're reproduced really well on these Hermes reprints. But because it's expanded into a larger, more premium size, you get to soak in the details more. I like that we have both the witch and vampire characters worked in here. We, of course, have to have a beautiful girl and the Phantom in action. And I like that this book actually gets the Phantom's iconic purple on the cover in terms of the background. And also, it may be just me, but I like how the vampire seems to maybe have been inspired. He just looks kind of like Count Yorga to me, so it kind of looks like Robert Quarry, but it may be just me. Then the rear also has a smaller version of the cover artwork and then the original rear cover blurb. So this is the same design and style as all the Hermes reprints of the Avon books. Like all of these, we have the iconic original prologue, how it all began for the Phantom, included for all those who came in late. And then you have the nice readable text font and block layout as in all of these. So it's in keeping with the design, and it is nice that Hermes gave the reprints a slightly more premium feel by doing this. These are not significantly long books, so to have a sort of nicer presentation form is more rewarding for the list price. And they have kept the beautiful essay from a Sorbonne lecturer, which is, of course, entitled "With the Phantom, Everything is Possible Except Boredom." Truer words have rarely been spoken, but that has been moved to the end. That's been in some of the previous volumes at the beginning, but they've just put it at the end here. This is a slightly longer volume. It's 156 pages here in this reprint. It's still a relatively quick read. All of these are so well put together, and that you pretty much can read, especially the shorter ones, in one sitting. But all of these you just don't want to put down because they're just wonderful phantom tales. But you can still definitely tell they are based on original newspaper strips in terms of it's a straightforward adventure, and you can just kind of pick up random volumes at will. But it's just wonderful to be able to read these because the original printings, which I have one here, are very collectible, and they rarely pop up, and they're usually pretty expensive. So actually getting the reprints, particularly when they go on sale, is actually a pretty good bargain. The only downside is I have noticed in some volumes, as is unfortunately something you run into with a lot of smaller independent publishers, there are a couple typos here and there, and particularly in the later volumes. None are particularly bad, but I did want to mention that you might see one or two very minor ones in some of these volumes. But that's really the only negative of these, is that certain volumes in the Hermes reprints do have a number of typos, but usually they're very minor, and none are absolutely horrible. Just kind of unfortunate that these are slightly marred by a few typos. So those are my overall thoughts on the Hermes Press reprint of Book 12 of the Avon Phantom novels, The Vampires and the Witch. This is just a wonderfully fun read. It's a great phantom adventure. It is blending together two pre-existing phantom stories, and it is the series creator, Lee Falk, getting to play around with horror movie tropes, and this makes for perfect October or spooky Halloween season reading, because you have the ghost who walks dealing with not just witches and witchcraft, but also an entire league of vampires essentially laying siege to a small, essentially almost Transylvanian city in a sort of never land European country that doesn't quite exist on the map, but is sort of an amalgam of different Transylvanian type countries that have existed in horror fiction. So this is just a fun book. It's all the Avon books have their charms, but especially the ones written by Lee Falk, because he was the heart and soul of the character, just have that extra magical sparkle that we all associate with the legendary Phantom. So I do highly recommend this book, and it makes for excellent Halloween reading. So as always, I hope my ramblings about the magic and power of the iconic ghost who walks, the Phantom, have been at least fun and informative. I will leave links to Hermes' website should you choose to purchase some of these. I do highly recommend them because it is a lot better to get these than trying to track down the rather expensive original printings. And as always, please do keep reading, keep supporting independent publishers and bookstores wherever possible. Happy phantoming, and thank you ever so much for watching.